Okay, so we're back again. So let's carry on with then question 3 of our question paper. Let me just go back here so that you can see my screen. There we go. Okay. So we go on to question 3. So question 3 comes out of Learning Unit 3, which was our risk and return learning unit. You've had a similar question in one of your tests, would have been test 2, where you've got 3 different assets. You're an investment manager, and you must select a portfolio of assets presented with returns relating to 3 different assets. You want to create a single portfolio comprising of the following combinations. So portfolio QR will consist of 40% of asset Q and 60% of asset R. And if you choose portfolio RS, your portfolio will consist, 30% of your portfolio will be asset R and 70% of your portfolio will be asset S. You can assume that the total value of the investment will remain constant and that it will be split as per the percentage indicated. In other words, these percentages here. So for 11 marks, calculate the expected return of the proposed portfolios, QR and RS. Okay, so this is again where you're going to read carefully, make sure what did they ask you to calculate. And also, guys, don't write down stuff. If they don't ask you to calculate something, don't put it down. I still see students doing that, and it really does waste your time. You need your 180 minutes for what they've asked you to do. And in bold, they've said round your answers to 2 decimal places. So if you do rounding to whole numbers, you'll lose a mark. I will deduct marks if you don't follow instructions, because essentially then the answer you're writing down is not the correct answer. And then there's certain things we know in finance that we never drop the decimals for, because the decimals are important to us to differentiate between 2 different returns, for instance. So here is our marking. So this is a 30-mark question from Learning Unit 3. So portfolio QR, which says take 40%, our portfolio will be 40% of Q and 60% of R. So for each of the returns, so take note what they've given us here. We haven't got rand values invested in the assets. We've got expected returns of the asset. And they've said calculate the expected return of the portfolios. So you take and remember you do this per year, so we will get a weighted return for each year, not for each asset. It has to be per year because we want the portfolio, in other words, each year the combination of the 2 assets. So 40% of Q plus 60% of R, in other words, 0.4 multiplied by 14% plus 0.6 multiplied by 18% equals 16.4% as the weighted return. And then you do that for each of the 4 years. You add up the 4 years total and then divide that by 4, so that you then get the expected return for the portfolio over the 4 years. So 5.5 marks for each of those calculations. And here's the other portfolio, which is just a different weighting of different assets, identical method as above. So that's an easy 11 marks if you have got that, if you can do that, and quick as well. You can definitely do that in less than 11 minutes. And then for 14 marks, which means you've got 15 minutes, calculate the standard deviation of each portfolio. So for both of these calculations above, what's the standard deviation? Also 2 decimal places. So you've got your standard deviation formulas on your formula sheet. Remember, if you go and have a look over here, Here's your this is your formula sheet, standard deviation. Remember, you've got two formulas. The first one is where we have got a probability related to the return of our asset, and the second one is where there's no probability. We've just got an expected return and a return of each asset. So what have we got in this one that we're looking at now? Do we have they given us a probability of each return? Are we going to use this first formula, or are we going to use the second formula? You have a look. We've got a return for each asset. We've calculated an expected return for each portfolio, but there's no probability. Yeah, they gave us no information about the probability of each of these returns. So that means you are going to use this formula here, which excludes that variable for probability. Okay. So that's, remember what I said, important at the beginning. You must practice with your formula sheet. So the standard deviation, whoops, where did I go? Standard deviation, I don't know what I did there. Standard deviation calculations should be easy because you've got the formula. So remember, the formula is the return minus the expected return squared. We add them up, divided by n minus 1, n being 4 years minus 1, divided by 3, and then we take the square root of that answer, so standard deviation 1.71. And then that wanted it for both portfolios, so 7 marks there and 7 marks here. So again, that should be an easy 14 marks that you could quickly write down. And then they wanted the coefficient of variation only for portfolio QR for 2 marks. So again, you've got this formula on the formula sheet, and you must just know what amounts to put into the variable. So your is the standard deviation divided by the RE. So 1.71 standard deviation that you've calculated here for portfolio QR only, over, and then the RE for portfolio QR, your RE from that. So you're taking your answer from this question and your answer from this question to then do this one. So you can see there's 2 method marks there. So as long as you've used the correct formula and taken the correct, your answer for the correct portion, you'll get those 2 method marks carried down. And then there was a 3-mark question for theory. Alpha Asset Managers invests a large portion of their portfolio in local companies in South Africa. Discuss how a possible increase in the corporate tax rate in South Africa would affect these companies and shareholders in turn. Okay, so for 3 marks, so that's again one of your learning objectives from Learning Unit 3, which is that section on the impact of international assets on a portfolio. Where they have given you, sorry, not that one. Where's the, is it at the end of the chapter? Types of risk, CAPM, I don't want that. I can't find it in the textbook now, but it's in Learning Unit 3 as well. Remember, there's that one section of theory where it gives you all the different types of risk that you've got, and tax rate risk is one of them. Then we've got question, let me just see, why is this going? I don't know, I've lost it. Okay, so then we've got question 4, which is for 35 marks. And the required here is to calculate the value of Legend Limited using the following business valuation models. 3 marks, calculate the value of Legend using the PE ratio. And take note again in the question, they want the value of the company. They haven't said what is the value of one share of the company. They've said what is the value of the company. So you must convert your answer in each case to being a value for the entire company as a whole. So the PE ratio method, the dividend growth model method, and then for 6 marks theory, discuss 3 pitfalls or disadvantages of using the price earnings valuation method. And then for 4 marks, there's a little calculation, again, using the equity beta, calculate the new required rate of return. So that's a bit of a kind of like a combination of a theory question. And then that 10 marks over there is a separate part of the question. This question that they've got here that we're looking at is in your textbooks, very similar. It was, I'll tell you now quickly what the question number is, if I can find it. I know this is a question I usually go through in class because it is such a good comprehensive question. Where's risk preferences? Oh, I'm in the wrong learning unit. So this will be out of your learning unit 5. Sorry guys, just give me a sec. Oh, nearly there. Question 5.3 in your textbook. So this is comes from question 5.3 in your textbooks. Extracted the following information relating to the company for the year 2017, and they've underlined that. So remember, you might have to adjust if they say you want to, for a specific year, you must, that this information is for the 2017 year. The number of ordinary shares in issue, the current market price, ex-dividend, which means after the dividend has been paid, the EPS for the 2017 year, the proposed dividend payout ratio, which means what percentage of the earnings per share is going to be paid out as a dividend, and then the previous 3 years, from 14 to 16, what the dividend was. The beta of Legend Limited is twice the market beta. So that's a little bit tricky. You have to know what the market beta is so that you can calculate the beta for Legend Limited. So remember, market beta is always 1. So that means that Legend Limited's beta is 2. The average industry PE ratio, risk-free rate of return, and the market rate of return. So this is RF, this is RM. Assume that no adjustment needs to be made to the industry PE ratio for company-specific risks. They might give you an adjustment. They might say for company-specific risks, Legend Limited needs to have the PE ratio increased by 2 above the industry ratio or whatever. Okay, so that's important information linked to that there. So calculate the value of the company using the PE ratio. So, oopsie, sorry. Our PE ratio is equal to the current price of the company over the EPS of the company. And we have to solve for, they've given us the EPS and they've given us the actual ratio, the 8. So using those 2 bits of information, we can then calculate the current price per share. Then we multiply that by the number of ordinary shares in issue, and that gives us the value of the company as a whole. Okay. That was for 3 marks. Then calculate the value of the company using the dividend growth model. There are 3 sections to doing this question. I've split it here between, you've got to do calculation A, B, and then C. So firstly, using the dividend growth model, this is the formula here, PO equals D1 over K minus G. Okay, because they didn't give us any information about an initial growth percentage and a terminal growth percentage. We can only calculate one growth percentage, which means we have to use the constant growth model on your formula sheet. We don't know what that G is, but given the information they've given us, we can calculate the value for G. So we basically are solving for R, and this is in your Learning Unit 2, finding growth rates. This formula comes out of Learning Unit 2. So we know that the EPS is 80. We know that the payout ratio is 25%, so that we know 2017's dividend value will be 20. Okay, and remember that will be DO, in other words, the very last dividend that was paid. Our formula requires us to calculate D1, so we then have to grow that by the growth rate. So we then have to calculate what the growth rate is. So this is using your financial calculator solving for R, given that 20 is the future value, 11.50 Rand is the present value. In other words, the oldest dividend was the present value and the newest dividends the future value. There are 3 growth periods in that. So from 14 to 2015 is 1 growth period, to 2016 is 2 growth periods, to 2017 is 3 growth periods. Remember, that's not the number of dividends, it's the number of times the dividend grew. So it's not 4, it's 3 for N. And then solve for R, and you get that G equals 20.26. You can use your formula solving for R in Learning Unit 2 if you don't have a financial calculator as well. So now that we know what G is, we can then go and calculate the cost of equity. So we can use our CAPM formula because they've given us RF and RM. So RF, they gave us that, plus 2 is the beta we've calculated, multiplied by RM minus RF. So the required rate of return of the company is 21.75. So we could then calculate the value of the company. So the value of the share is then going to be DO, which is 20, multiplied by the growth rate, which is 20.26, so that I can calculate D1. So this is D1 over K, which is my required rate of return, which we've calculated here, minus G, which is the growth rate, which we calculated here. So you had to calculate each of the inputs for that dividend growth model. So you can then calculate the value per share multiplied by the 1450 shares, and then again get a valuation for the company as a whole using the dividend growth model. Very nice question, 35 marks, and if you understand the question and you've practiced it out of the textbook, you'll be able to get these 30 marks. Lots of calculations, lots of application of different theory across the whole semester in this question. And then the last question was then the theory for 6 marks, discuss pitfalls of PE ratio. That comes straight out of textbook learning objectives. And then for 4 marks, if the current equity beta of Legend Limited had to decrease by 1/4, so remember it's currently 2, so it's going to go down to, what is that, 1/4, 1.75, and the market risk premium was calculated at 8.5, calculate the new required rate of return for Legend. So again, using our CAPM formula, we then have to recalculate the answer, which is then 19. So 6.25 RF stayed the same. We have now changed our beta from 2 to 1.5. And the market premium had to change to 8.5, and then just recalculate CAPM. Everybody okay with that, with those methods that we've got there so far? Guys, okay so far? It is a lot of work, and it also shows you how much revision that you've got to do. And if you haven't prepared for revision for today, then for next week, Thursday the 17th, make sure you've done a lot of revision. So by the time we go over an exam paper next week on the 17th, you've got a much better ground in yourself from the revision that you've done, and then it's going to be easier for you to understand and get value out of working through an exam paper. Because it's no use if you've done no revision and you're just sitting there listening to me explain the answers of this exam paper. You should be testing yourself as we go along now what you know and what you don't know. So question 4.5 for 10 marks. You've obtained the following cash flow of the company covering the following 4 years. So we've got 4 years worth of cash flow. And then after 2021, the company's cash flows are expected to increase at a constant growth rate of 3% per annum. And the company has got a weighted average cost of capital, WACC, of 12%. Calculate the current value of MIF Limited using the free cash flow method. Okay, so again, they want the value of the company using the free cash flow method. So remember, on your formula sheet, you have got the formula for working out the actual free cash flow, but remember you have to use the variable growth model for working out the valuation of the company. The actual formula for valuing a company using free cash flow is not on your formula sheet. So let's have a look at what we've got to. Oopsie, sorry, wrong one. I want to go back to the. Here we go. So remember, this is very similar to the layout is almost identical to the layout that you use for calculating the present value of a share using the dividend growth model with variable growth. So you've got your 4 years worth of initial growth. They gave you these 4 amounts. Your present value factor using the WACC of 12% that they gave us. So you can calculate the present value of those 4 years of cash flow. Add them together, and that gives us our present value of the initial high growth period. Then they said after that, our growth will just be 3% per annum. So we take the last year and we grow it by 3%. And that is over WACC, in other words, K minus G. So this is again the same as D1 over K minus G. So D1 means take the last D in inverted commas, grow it by the terminal growth rate of 3% to get D1, and then over K minus G, so K being the WACC minus the growth rate of 3% given to us, multiplied by, and we use the present value factor of that last year, that same one, will then give us the terminal value, and then we add those two together to get the total estimated value of Rockstar Limited. Okay, so this is the free cash flow valuation model, but you have used this formula, variable growth model formula, you've used this formula to calculate it. Okay. And then just remember that when we are calculating valuations for the company, we must use WACC to calculate the present value factor and not the cost of equity. And you can see here they've said if the student used the incorrect percentage, we have to deduct 2 marks from your calculation. So just take note when you're learning all these different valuations that what the percentage that we need to calculate the present value, is it the cost of capital, is it the required rate of return, is it the WACC? Which percentage must we use so that you know which one it is? You don't lose marks because you've used the incorrect one. Let me just see how we're doing for time. Okay, so we can do one more question. So question 5 is 30 marks. And here again, this goes back to our exam chapters 6 and 7. I think this is a question that comes out of Learning Unit 7. So another 30 marks out of those last 2 exam chapters. So we've got Supreme Limited as deciding between 2 mutually exclusive investment projects, which means we can only do one or the other, mega and major. Each of them involve investment in new manufacturing equipment in order to enable Supreme to obtain a competitive edge within the industry that it operates. Both projects have unequal lives of 2 years for Project Mega and 5 years for Project Major. They shouldn't have used the word both there. It should just say the projects have got unequal lives, 2 years for Mega and 5 years for Major. Okay, so we did yesterday in class, we did this unequal lives section. You've been provided with the following information in order to perform your calculation as required. So here's Project Mega's cash flows, initial investment out, and the 2 years investment in. We have got a weighted average cost of capital of 7% for investment appraisal purposes. And 5.1 says, assuming a reinvestment approach, calculate the net present value of Project Mega, 13 marks. So reinvestment approach says that I must take Project Mega and I must calculate or decide on what the lowest common denominator is between the useful lives of Mega and Major, such that they are both of equal useful lives, and then I can calculate the net present value. So Major has got 5 years, and Mega is 2 years. So our lowest common denominator between 2 and 5 is what? 5 years for Major and 2 years for Mega. What's our lowest common denominator? In other words, how many years do I have to reinvest Project Mega over to get it to be equivalent in length to Project Major? What's the lowest common denominator between 2 and 5? Do you remember, Jay, we did this yesterday? Okay, so that means into what number are both of these numbers divisible? The lowest number into which both of these numbers are divisible. So 2 isn't divisible into 5. So then I need to say 5. The next multiple of 5 up is 10. 5 will be divisible into 10 twice, and 2 will be divisible into 10 5 times. So my lowest common denominator is 10. So I have to then reinvest Project Mega over 10 years to then make it comparable. So here are your workings. 10 years we want down here, initial investment and then reinvestment over 10 years. So remember, the way we do this is we take the initial investment out plus the year 1 in and year 2 in. Then in the last year of the cash flows, which in this case is year 2, we then repeat the cash flows. So in year 2, at the end of year 2, we then reinvest our 4.5 million. So in other words, cash out again in year 2, and then cash in year 3 and year 4. At the end of year 4, it will also be cash out again and in year 5 and year 6. In year 6, it will be cash out and so on. So you follow the examples and the questions in the textbook, but you've got to get all of these cash flow amounts in each year correct. You've got to get your present value factor correct using the 7% investment appraisal percentage. Calculate your present value and then calculate the total net present value. And you can see in this question, all of those are individual marks and only the total is a method mark. So you have to get all of these cash flows and your present value factors correct in order to get all of those marks, 13 marks. If you make a mistake, you use the incorrect percentage there, you'll lose all of those marks. If your cash flow is incorrect, you'll lose all of those marks. So this is a very easy question to get the 13 marks if you get it right, but it can also be a disaster and you can lose the whole lot if you're not sure of what you're doing. Okay, so that's a reinvestment question. Then for Project Mega, they asked us to calculate the annualized net present value for each project if Project Major's net present value was calculated at 8.5 million. Okay, so we've got a net present value for Project Mega. We calculated ourselves. They've given us Project Major's net present value, and they've asked us now to calculate the annualized net present value for each project. So we also did this yesterday. So remember, the annualized net present value formula says that we must take the net present value for our project. Where am I? So we've got to calculate the NPV for Mega using the cash flows that they gave us. Oh, that is Mega. Okay. So this one over here, over the 10 years, is net present value if we're using the reinvestment approach. We've got to calculate what I would call the simple net present value for Mega, which means just its 3 years worth of cash flow, so that we've got that. Okay. So cash flow out and cash flow in for 2 years, 7%. We're going to discount them using a present value of 7%, calculate net present value. Then the annualized net present value of Mega is taking the present value that we've calculated there. N is 2 years. The 7% is the value for I, and we then calculate the value for PMT. So net present value divided by the present value factor of an annuity. So that's one way you can calculate it, or you can calculate, this is the way they've got it in your textbooks, the net present value divided by the net present, divided by the present value annuity factor, with N being 2 and I being 7, 1.808. And then gives you the annualized net present value. But just take note that this would not be on your table, because I think on your tables, let me just double check, you don't have, before I tell you an untruth. So remember, you've got to use your annuity, present value of an annuity tables. Oh yeah, no, we do. So we've got 7% and we've got 2 years. So you can look this 1.88 up on your tables that will be with you, that you'll be given. So the NPV divided by the annuity present value factor gives you the annualized net present value. And then we do the same thing for Major. They gave us that NPV. We've got to calculate the annuity factor and then compare them. And then you've got to compare the two annualized net present values. So obviously in this case, Mega has got the highest ANPV. And so you can come to the conclusion, select Project Mega for 1 mark. Reason, it's got the highest annualized net present value. So there's 2 marks for your decision there as well. And then there's a theory question. For 7 marks, upon further analysis of your calculations, you've determined that Project Mega, in terms of timing options, so remember options is one of the theory sections in Learning Unit 7, provides greater benefits compared to major. Explain in your report to management the meaning of timing options and the ways in which these benefits occur. So because they've asked you, explain in a report to management, that's the format that your answer must take. You must present your answer as if you were writing a report to management, explaining what timing options mean and how those benefits would take place. So for 7 marks, if you have a look at the memo, there's 1 mark for describing the meaning of timing options and a maximum of 3 marks each for each of the options, total 7 marks. So 2 options, 3 marks each, and 1 for describing. So again, this is just your theory, so this has come straight out of the textbook. Timing options relate to when project actions are undertaken and permits project implementation only when it is profitable to do so. So there is the initiation or deferment option, and there is the abandonment option. So a mark each for naming the 2 options, a mark for explaining what timing options are, and then 2 marks for expanding on the explanation of each of those different options. So question 6, okay, so we've got to the end of the paper, so that was well timed. So question 6, 5 marks theory, explain the shape of the yield curve according to the liquidity preference theory. Which learning unit is this out of? Interest rates and bond valuation, learning unit 4. So again, remember learning unit 4, what are your learning objectives? That will tell you what your theory questions are, could possibly be. So 5 marks for theory. So remember in this paper, 31 theory marks. Do not throw those 31 marks away. Then the second part of the paper is Mr. Khaleesi purchased a 7-year bond with a par value of 20,000. And so this is also your learning unit 4. And an annual coupon rate of 16%. Required rate of return is 14% per annum for Mr. Khaleesi's investments. And coupon payments are made biannually, okay, which means twice a year. Calculate the value of the bond on purchase date. So you've got your bond valuation formula right here on your formula sheet. And you can use that formula. Or you can use the financial calculator method. So future value will be 20,000, which is the amount we're going to get at the maturity date of the bond. The interest rate is 7%, sorry, it is 14%, divided by 2 because it is being paid twice a year. So each of the 2 payments, we will be receiving 7%. The value for N is going to be M times N, Mary times Nelly, again because there is more than one compounding period per year. So 2 times 7, N is going to be 14. PMT is the face value of the bond multiplied by the coupon rate of the bond. So 20,000 times 16%. And remember that 16% is the annual rate. So we then have to divide that by 2 because that PMT is divided into 2 separate payments. So each of the 2 PMTs will be 1,600. So that's your inputs into the model. FE equals 20,000, I equals 7, N equals 14, and PMT equals 1,600. Solve for present value, 21,749, or otherwise, so you can't probably see properly, but in pencil at the bottom here, I've got got it worked out if the students had have used the formula. So you can use the formula as long as all your inputs are correct, or you can use the financial calculator. That's 5 marks. And 7 marks, if subsequent economic shocks lead to a downturn in the local economy, resulting in a 3% increase in the investor's required rates of return. So now my required rate of return has gone up from 14% plus 3% to 17%. Calculate the profit or loss that Mr. Khaleesi would make if he sold the bond after 4 years. So in other words, we must now recalculate the value of the bond as it would be at the end of 4 years if the required rate of return was 17%. And then we compare that value to what he initially paid for it. So our future value is still 20,000. We're doing here. I is now R divided by M, R divided by Mary. So 17 is our value for R, now divided by 2 is 8.5. N, M for Mary times N for Nelly. There's now only 3 years remaining. So 3 years to maturity multiplied by 2 payments a year. So N is 6. PMP is the identical amount, 1,600 per payment that I receive. And we recalculate the present value to now be 19,544. And then we calculate the initial value, 21,749, multiplied by its value at the end of 4 years. So he would then make a loss of the value of the difference between the two. And then the very last question is then for 3 marks, if current inflation rate is 6%, calculate the real rate of return using Fisher's formula by using the investor's nominal rate of return in question 6.3 above. So just Fisher's formula, you have to remember it, memorize it, and then substitute whatever the values are that they've given you here. There were errors in the memorandum, so that's why there's lots of scratchings out and markings on this paper, because where they've got 0.08, that should have been 0.06. So remember, your Fisher formula is not on your formula sheet. You have to memorize it, which is 1 plus I equals 1 plus R times 1 plus H, with 1 plus I being the nominal rate, R being the real rate, and H being inflation. And then you just substitute whatever they've given you and calculate it out. Okay, so that was then our 2018 paper that the students wrote in the first sitting. So it gives you a very good idea of the split of marks across the whole paper, as well as the kind of difficulty level of questions that you might get. Okay, so hopefully you've managed to follow all of that. The recording is here for you to go through later as well. And then we will do another exam paper next week on Thursday when I see you guys again. Okay, guys, so remember, any questions that you've got, you must give them to me on Thursday, because I won't see you again after that before your exam. So do some serious revision between now and Thursday, so that you know exactly what you don't understand, that you need any clarification on. Okay, guys, end of the recording. And